So one thing, I know I'm in a educational environment when, as usual, the front row is basically empty, and there are people standing in the back. It's very reminding me of my college days.
We didn't put the plugs up front. We should have done that.
Yes, exactly. Classic structural incentives. So what I'm going to try to do is say a few things in terms of conceptual models that come from thinking about social media and education in attempt to provoke some thinking. Hopefully I will do so. Doing so in brief remarks usually means that you say things that are a little basic and crude and therefore are academically debatable, which I am happy to engage in with academics, but that's not my goal for these remarks. And I'm only indirectly talking about technology, because one of the things I think is interesting about social media technology is the technology stack in general is not deep. It's actually more interesting about what happens with an ecosystem of different kinds of players and what happens when you have everyone being a publisher, everyone having an identity, real relationships being mirrored online, and what kinds of applications you can develop from that. Now, the other thing I'm going to do to start the remarks a little bit is, and more remarks, questions, something, is I actually always find this topic in particular, one of the things to do is start with kind of the radical question of, if you were building it all from scratch now, what would it look like? And yes, there's political infeasibility. Yes, there's inertia of institutions. There's a whole wide variety of things. But unless you ask that question of what you would do if you were to build it from scratch now, you can't really tell if your incremental improvements are going towards a North Star or Pole Star that are particularly useful. And, my sense when I look at the general thing, everything from curriculum to institutions to pedagogical process, that if I were looking at this and building it from scratch today, it would look radically different than what it looks like today, right? It's not like a 1.1. It's kind of like these are, like, if what is today is numbers, my thing would be in Cyrillic, right, or something, right? It'd be very different. And what's interesting when you take the kind of radical question even one kind of bold step further, basically it's not only what would it be like from scratch now, but if you think, okay, so why is there a big difference between what you would do today if you were built from scratch and what exists, is obviously we live in this world where there's accelerating change, world is flat, intensifying global competition, technology patterns changing, the requirements for, what it is to prepare someone to be a healthy, functioning member of society, changing at a fast pace. Well, that change vector is going to continue or intensify. So if you just put in a new calcified system, right, it would be updated, but it would start getting out to date faster. And so one of the things I think when you think about curriculum, institutions, and pedagogical process is how do you make them adaptive, and how do you put in place something that will continue to iterate. And I was really glad to see the OLI thing, because I actually think that kind of data, use of data in multiple different constituencies to iterate on the actual product of what you're doing is actually a kind of a key thing that you use in technology platforms. And it prompted me to say a few things at the end. I'll say a few things at the end of remarks about LinkedIn in this regard, because I think it'll be hopefully interesting. Now, I think that people have thought about kind of what happens, like everybody, not just the people in the room, and, we have a relatively forward-thinking group here, have thought about, what happens if you apply Wikipedia to textbooks and get the right kind of authority and accreditation in it and so forth. But it's not just that. I mean, what happens if you think about it for teaching materials, tests? How do you take networks into having students self-organize into learning groups? That's not per se thinking about, kind of like, oh, they choose their own coursework and kind of assemble your own class and everyone has their own personalized class. That may be interesting too, but just, for example, if you actually think about how do you reinforce pedagogy, is what are all the different networks that people are in as part of doing this. And so I think that the way to, let me kind of walk through what I think is a classic. I'm going to use what happens when I'm talking to traditional media as a way they understand businesses, as a way they understand social media, take education as a instance of it, or as a parallel to it, and then kind of walk into some interesting concepts. So first thing, when people think about social media, they think of social media as media, which is a broadcast. It's, for example, how do I have a video or something, or a one-directional, like I get my content to you and you learn it. Then they think, okay, social media as kind of interactive CRM, maybe it's polls, whatever. So I get my content to you, you interact with some data comes upstream, and that changes what I'm doing. And that's not bad, it's a good thing. The thing that I think is most potentially interesting and radical about thinking about what's happening in terms of Web 2.0 trends and social media and education as ultimate ultimate possibilities are when you think about social media as networks. And it isn't, I'm deliberately sidestepping questions of accreditation and questions of how do you make sure it's the right content and all the rest of the stuff. I think that's very interesting and important. But it's a question of how do you push more of the activity into equivalent of self-organizing networks, whether that's study groups, but not just that, but also the question of what kinds of curriculum. Because, for example, one of the questions that I've thought about from a LinkedIn perspective, and actually it was one of the things that caused me to found LinkedIn, is my estimation is I haven't seen a curriculum yet that I think prepares people for the economic side of current life. And I'm not just talking about the personal finance side. It's what does a modern career look like? Because the modern career doesn't look like, oh, I choose I'm going to be a lawyer or a doctor, and I'm going to do that for 10, 20, 30 years. And sure, maybe I don't work for one company anymore for that entire thing, but I still kind of doing the career ladder, and all that's doing is now I work at HP, and then I work at eBay, and then I work at, the Expedia. I was trying to remember which company it was, and so forth. And that's kind of a career path. I think careers are very differently constituted, and what counts as kind of how do I do that, and what are the kinds of things that I need to learn and do are just very different. And so one of the things that I think is usually when you make a few remarks, you say something this isn't really a secret, but it's kind of quasi-secret. It's not one of the things we talk about a lot. We have a whole project in the back end of LinkedIn to try to identify, you can think of it as Careerpedia, what all the different kinds of jobs and functions there are, right? And what jobs lead to that, because you use the data that people put in as kind of I was this, and then I was this, then I was here. What skill sets are part of that in terms of, like what counts as what is the ontology or topology of skill sets look like? Because, by the way, this changes with changing economies and changing work practices and changing technologies. So, for example, 10 years ago, if someone told you, I'm skilled in Hadoop, you'd go, what the fuck are you talking about? Right? Whereas now, actually,
some of you might be saying that right now.
Google search useful. And so what I think, what's interesting is how do we use these networks, not just to deploy, how does the activity of pedagogy happen, and how does it organize not just within, for example, educational institutions, but also, say, for example, families and their kids, student groups, whether or not they're in the same institution or not, and all the rest of it, but also what the target should be. Like, because frankly, I don't think, one of the things is, how do you design a curriculum today to prepare people to be, for what a modern work economic life looks like? It's not just teach them, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Obviously, as a baseline, that's important to get right. And, frequently when I think about education, you think about top third, middle third, bottom third. And clearly, if we're failing at the reading, writing, arithmetic for the bottom third, or whatever percentage it is, you need to fix that. And there are tools, potentially study groups or people interacting with each other in game-like dynamics to make that happen. But part of the thing is you think about how do we continue to have kind of economic growth as a nation and being a superpower in the way that we'd want, and preparing people to be there. We can't be a nation where there's only, because like people frequently say more math science education. That's great, and we absolutely should be doing that. But the question is, if all we are is kind of engineers and finance people, plus some services industry and a bunch of people serving lattes, that doesn't really work, right? So you have to get, you have to get that at a much broader way. And so part of the question is, what is the pedagogy of what we need to teach? And I guess I'll say one last kind of maybe radical remark. Frequently, when I talk about these things with my friends who are in the academy, I was actually en route to being a professor at one point, and then kind of hit the ripcord and jacked out. Is there like, oh, that sounds like vocational training, and it's like, well, it might have some vocational training in it, right? I really don't care what it's called if people are prepared to be like civics, healthy members of society in terms of government. Economics, having a good economic life, physical world, science, so forth, understand how the world works around them. It's how you navigate all these spaces. And the economic one, navigating it well in a way that kind of continues the growth of our society is absolutely critical. And I don't see anything, and I can go through more detail of this, but I think I'm just about out of time. I don't see anything in the current curriculum in terms of the real fundamental building blocks. And actually, I'll use one example. So classically, because we are the whole educational curriculum is about individual assessment in terms of, did you get an A on the test, etc. Almost all of modern work is collaborative. The tools that you need to teach people to be good economic workers is how to work in collaborative environments. And at least when I went through, and maybe it's very different now, and I'd be delighted to hear that, there was nothing in that prepared for that. And it's the kind of things of these kinds of basic structural. It's not just statistics rather than calculus. It's also, for example, how do you do risk management in your personal economic life, because one career at one institution used to be the way to lock that down. That doesn't happen anymore. Anyway, all these sorts of things. And with that, I will stop initial remarks.